At 7:12 a.m. on September 25, 1939, 19-year-old Private Jan Nowak lay hidden beneath the shattered rafters of a burned-out attic on Nowolipki Street in northern Warsaw, his worn Mosin-Nagant rifle resting on a splintered windowsill, his heartbeat steady despite the thunder of approaching boots. Below him, more than 600 SS troops, infantry from SS Heimwehr Danzig supported by armored cars and MG-34 teams, advanced in tight formation through the smoke-choked street, methodical, confident, unstoppable. Jan had never fought in a real battle, had never fired at a living target in combat, had survived only 3 weeks of the war, and claimed 0 confirmed kills. Yet at this moment he was the sole defender of an entire district, the last man covering the escape route of hundreds of trapped civilians fleeing toward the southern alleys. As the first SS officer lifted a loudhailer and ordered the neighborhood to surrender, Jan adjusted his sights, exhaled slowly, and prepared to fire the shot that would ignite 3 hours of chaos, fear, and legend. How could one teenager with one rifle delay an entire SS battalion? And why did the Germans need armored cars, flamethrowers, and a full lockdown to hunt a single soldier hiding in a dark attic? By late September 1939, Warsaw had become a city suspended between resistance and ruin. For 3 weeks, the Polish capital had endured the relentless assault of the German invasion, an offensive that combined the speed of armored thrusts with the crushing force of Luftwaffe bombardments. Streets once filled with trams and markets were now shattered corridors lined with burnt facades, collapsed apartments, and the bitter smell of cordite drifting on the wind. The siege was tightening day by day. German high command believed Warsaw would fall within hours. Polish commanders knew they were fighting without hope of reinforcement. Yet pockets of resistance continued to flare like embers refusing to die out. Warsaw's northern districts, Muranów, Naluki, Nowolipki, had become some of the most contested ground in the entire city. These neighborhoods, packed with narrow lanes and tall, connected tenements, formed a maze where defenders could vanish between rooftops, basements, and courtyards. For the Wehrmacht, these areas were obstacles. For the SS, they were opportunities, places to test terror tactics meant to break civilian morale. On the morning of September 25th, elements of SS Heimwehr Danzig and attached units of Einsatzgruppe 3 were ordered to secure the district, sweep all residences, and force the remaining population south toward German checkpoints. But reports from the day before indicated delays, ambushes, and unexplained sniper fire coming from upper floors and attics. The SS sought to eradicate these threats swiftly. What they did not know was that in at least one building, only one man remained. The strategic situation around Warsaw was equally grim. The Polish army, battered by the initial shock of Blitzkrieg, had suffered catastrophic losses in open ground. Armored brigades were shattered, communication networks were collapsing, ammunition reserves were dwindling everywhere. Yet despite these conditions, the defenders inside Warsaw fought with a desperation born of duty and necessity. Civilians labored alongside soldiers to dig trenches, extinguish fires, and rescue survivors from bombed-out buildings. The city was not simply a battlefield. It was a shelter for tens of thousands who refused to abandon their homes. This mixture of military and civilian elements made every street unpredictable, every staircase a potential ambush. For German forces confident in their sweeping victories across Poland, the defenders' persistence created unexpected complications. Wehrmacht infantry had already learned that street fighting in Warsaw bore little resemblance to the rapid advances they had enjoyed elsewhere. In the countryside, tanks could maneuver freely. In narrow city blocks, they became metal coffins if unsupported. Artillery bombardments often collapsed buildings onto roads, blocking their own supply lines. Snipers, lone machine gunners, and small Polish detachments repeatedly turned intersections into killing grounds. The SS, frustrated by resistance and determined to crush it with overwhelming force, began deploying larger numbers of troops into areas they considered pacified. Their standard method involved advancing in staggered columns. Riflemen in front, MG-34 teams on the flanks, armored cars forming a mobile shield. But the Germans underestimated the psychological and tactical advantages that a single hidden rifleman could wield in dense urban terrain. A sniper on a rooftop controlled not just the street directly below, but the entire momentum of an advance. Every shot he fired could stall a column, force soldiers to seek cover, or draw fire away from civilians trying to escape. In Warsaw's constricted neighborhoods, a well-placed sniper could make even a battalion feel blind. By September 25th, rumors of a ghost marksman had already circulated among SS platoons operating in the north. They believed multiple shooters were coordinating across rooftops. In reality, most of the resistance fighters had already withdrawn the night before, slipping away to reinforce southern districts or evacuate wounded comrades. Only one man, Jan Nowak, a conscript barely out of adolescence, remained inside the block now designated for German clearance. Jan's position at Nowolipki Street held accidental strategic value. His attic overlooked a major approach route the SS needed to secure in order to push toward the city center. Behind his building, half-collapsed alleyways funneled fleeing civilians toward safer ground. If the SS reached that bottleneck, hundreds who had spent the night hiding in basements would be cut off. Jan understood this instinctively. He knew that firing even a single shot would reveal his position. But he also knew that doing nothing would condemn those fleeing behind him. Meanwhile, German commanders were confident the operation would proceed in minutes, not hours. Their intelligence suggested minimal resistance. Their troops were well-armed, well-trained, and reinforced by armored vehicles. Against such strength, a lone sniper should have been irrelevant. Yet urban warfare often hinges not on numbers, but on moments. Moments when a single action forces commanders to hesitate, reevaluate, or commit disproportionate resources to a seemingly small threat. That moment would begin at exactly 7:12 a.m. When Jan's rifle cracked through the morning haze and history lurched in a direction no one in the SS column could have anticipated. Jan Nowak was born in 1920 on the northern side of Warsaw, in a cramped tenement block where families lived stacked floor upon floor, the walls thin enough for neighbors to hear every argument, every lullaby, every whispered prayer. His father, a locksmith who had fought in the Polish-Soviet War of 1920, taught him how to hold a rifle long before he understood what a battlefield was. By the age of 12, Jan could hit tin cans at 30 meters with his father's old Mosin Nagant, a relic captured decades earlier. The rifle was nearly as tall as he was, but he treated it with a reverence that hinted at the life he might someday live. Like many boys in Warsaw, he joined a paramilitary youth program. Like many youths of that era, he dreamed of becoming a soldier. What he did not dream of was facing an entire battalion alone. When the German invasion began on September 1, 1939, Jan was 3 weeks shy of his 19th birthday. He enlisted immediately, though he had no illusions about Poland's strength against the Blitzkrieg. His training was short, improvised, and chaotic. Units were formed and dissolved within days. Ammunition shipments arrived incomplete. Entire platoons were scattered and reconstituted as the front collapsed. Jan was assigned to a mixed infantry, militia detachment operating in the northern districts, but as casualties mounted, he found himself increasingly separated from anything resembling an organized army. His role shifted into that of a sharpshooter, not because he had formal sniper training, but because commanders could see he handled his rifle with confidence and precision. Snipers were a scarce resource. Ammunition was scarcer. In the labyrinth of Warsaw's rooftops and corridors, even one dependable shot could mean the difference between a platoon advancing or being wiped out by a machine gun nest. The deeper reason Jan stayed behind on September 24th, however, had nothing to do with military assignments. His family had lived on Nowolipki Street for 2 generations. His mother and younger sister, Zofia, had refused to abandon their home when the first bombs fell. They believed the fighting would pass. But the siege worsened, and evacuation grew impossible. On the night before the SS sweep, Jan helped escort a group of civilians southward. He could have gone with them. He would have been safer. Instead, he returned to the attic. A survivor later claimed Jan had muttered, "If I leave, they will come from the north, and everyone behind this block will be trapped." That attic, dimly lit by a broken skylight, became his post, not because he was ordered to defend it, but because he feared what would happen if nobody was there. To understand why Jan's decision mattered, one must understand the enemy he faced. SS Heimwehr Danzig, the force advancing toward Nowolipki, was not a random infantry unit. It was a formation forged from paramilitary groups loyal to the Nazi Party, men steeped in ideology, experienced in oppression, and accustomed to using terror as a weapon. Their mission was to break resistance and dismantle civilian morale, not merely to occupy ground. The Einsatzgruppe elements accompanying them had an even darker reputation. They were trained to hunt, categorize, and eliminate. Even among German soldiers, these units were feared for their ruthlessness. For civilians trapped in Warsaw's northern districts, the approach of such forces was a nightmare made real. From the beginning of the invasion, the Germans applied overwhelming psychological pressure. Leaflets dropped from the sky demanded immediate surrender. Loudspeakers broadcast promises of humane treatment, followed by threats of annihilation. Buildings marked with sniper fire or resistance activity were shelled indiscriminately. Civilians were often caught in the crossfire, becoming unwilling shields or accidental obstacles. The aim was simple: break Warsaw's will by breaking Warsaw's people. Against this apparatus of organized violence stood young men like Jan, poorly equipped, poorly trained, yet determined to defend the streets they had grown up in. The convergence of his personal history and the tactical situation made Jan's position uniquely important. His attic overlooked a narrow corridor that funneled SS troops from Nowolipki Street into Nowolipki. If that corridor fell, civilians fleeing through the alleyways would be cut off. The retreating militiamen who passed Jan on the night of the 24th had assumed the block was doomed. They believed resistance there would last minutes at best. What none of them anticipated was how one well-placed marksman could warp the battlefield. Urban sniper warfare is a strange, intimate form of combat. Unlike open-field engagements, where distance and maneuvering dominate, urban sniping hinges on patience, timing, and the constant shifting of angles. A sniper does not simply fire. He hunts, waits, listens. Every creak of a floorboard, every glint of metal through dust, every change in the cadence of footsteps becomes a signal. Jan had a natural talent for this. His father had taught him to track movement in forests and fields, to breathe in patterns, to sense tension before animals bolted. Those instincts translated flawlessly to the cramped geometry of Warsaw's attics. While SS soldiers marched with rigid discipline, Jan learned to move like smoke across rafters, invisible until the moment he chose not to be. The German underestimation of individual resistance fighters in Warsaw also contributed heavily to the drama that unfolded. Commanders assumed any sniper activity came from organized groups. Their doctrine emphasized crushing nests with overwhelming force, grenades, flamethrowers, armored vehicles. Yet on September 25th, there was no nest. There was only January, and his presence forced the SS to respond disproportionately. When the first shot rang out, striking the officer with the loudhailer, the entire battalion froze. Doctrine dictated caution. Fear whispered of ambushes. Their reaction was mechanical. Establish cover, deploy MG-34s, sweep rooftops. That pause, just minutes long, allowed dozens of civilians to slip through the alleys behind Jan's position. Several eyewitness accounts from Warsaw describe Jan not as a trained soldier, but as a quiet, introspective boy who seemed older in silence than in speech. A neighbor recalled seeing him carry groceries for elderly tenants, then spend evenings cleaning the same rifle he would use in battle. A childhood friend described him as someone who could disappear into a room without leaving it. Such recollections suggest a personality built for sniping, observant, calm, patient. But courage is something different. Courage is choosing to act when action seems useless. Courage is staying when every instinct says run. And it was courage, not training, that kept Jan in that attic. The tragic irony of his situation was that he never intended to become a symbol. He did not imagine delaying hundreds of armed men. He hoped only to slow them long enough for civilians to escape. His rifle carried 20 rounds at most. His attic had no food, no water, and no reinforcement. The walls around him were thin. One burst from an MG-34 could tear them apart. Yet he stayed, because in the chaos of a collapsing city, that small act mattered. In the hours leading to dawn, Jan inspected his rifle meticulously. He cleaned the bolt, adjusted his sights, and counted each round twice. He stuffed cloth into gaps in the walls to reduce muzzle flash visibility. He mapped in his head the quickest ways to crawl between rafters. He listened to the distant artillery and knew the SS would come with the morning. The last entry found in a civilian diary referencing him read, "The boy with the rifle returned. I don't think he expects to live through tomorrow." At 7:12 a.m. When he fired that first shot, Jan began a sequence of events that would ripple through the entire northern district. What compelled him to pull the trigger? Compassion? Duty? Fear disguised as bravery? Or the simple, unyielding belief that even one person can shape the fate of many? That question, unanswered then, unanswered now, is what makes his story endure. At 7:12 a.m., the rifle cracked like a whip across Nowolipki Street. The first shot was clean, deliberate, and devastating. The SS officer holding the loudhailer jerked backward as the bullet struck just below his collarbone, spinning him onto the cobblestones. His device clattered beside him, its metallic echo swallowed by sudden panic. For a heartbeat, the entire column froze. Hundreds of boots halted in unison. The armored car behind them hissed as its brakes locked, and the air seemed to pause between disbelief and rage. Snipers were expected, but not this early, not this accurately, not in the first seconds of the advance. Then chaos rushed in. Soldiers dove for cover. MG-34 gunners swung their barrels toward rooftops. Officers barked orders in clipped shouts that overlapped until none of them made sense. Midnight, confusion while the SS scrambled. Jan slid back from the window, crawled across beams blackened by fire, and repositioned himself near a second firing hole. A knot of broken plaster he had cleared the night before. Dust fell around him, stirred by distant artillery. He wiped sweat from his brow, slowed his breathing, and counted the seconds until his next shot. Below, the SS attempted to reform their line. A sergeant pointed upward, shouting that the sniper must be in the third building from the corner. MG-34 fire erupted, stitching holes through shutters and brick, scattering pigeons into the air in frantic bursts. But Jan was already gone from that spot, moving in the shadows like the story's veterans told new recruits, the ghost on the rafters. 012, second shot Jan sighted in on a machine gun team dragging their tripod into position. He exhaled, squeezed, and the assistant gunner fell first, the weapon half set on the sidewalk. Before the SS realized the shot had come from a different angle, Jan had already crawled back. Every move he made was quiet, measured, rehearsed dozens of times the previous night. His fingers burned from gripping hot wooden beams, his knees trembled on the brittle supports, but he kept moving. Below, civilians sprinted through alleys, encouraged by the momentary halt. Mothers clutching children. Elderly men leaning on makeshift canes. Young couples dragging bags that were half empty and half forgotten. Jan heard their footsteps behind the wall and prayed they would not stumble into German fire. 028, SS response. The SS regrouped quickly. Officers ordered 2 squads to sweep the buildings on the left while armored cars pushed cautiously forward. The MG-34 resumed firing in long, angry bursts. Bullets tore through the plaster around Jan, showering him with powder. He stayed motionless, eyes focused on the street. When the machine gun barrel swung just slightly too far right, Jan took his third shot, straight into the gunner's wrist. The MG-34 clattered away as the man screamed, a sound quickly drowned by officers shouting Scharfschütze. Suchen. Hoch. Hoch. Sniper. Search. Up. Up. 050. Movement between rooftops. Jan moved again. He climbed through a gap between 2 attics where the wall had collapsed from earlier shelling. On the other side, a crooked chimney offered partial cover. He planted his rifle, steadied his breath, and spotted a squad advancing toward a staircase leading into his building. They were 10 meters from the door. If they breached the stairwell, his position would become a trap. Jan fired. A quick, efficient sequence. 1 shot to drop the point man, 1 more at a second soldier who attempted to pull him aside, a third into the wooden railing to spark confusion. The squad fell back, dragging their wounded, reporting multiple shooters. Jan allowed himself a bitter, ironic smile. They believed he was a team. That misunderstanding would buy him minutes, precious, life-saving minutes. 105, armored CAR advances. An SS armored car rolled forward, its turret scanning windows. Jan shifted his angle to avoid being seen. The vehicle's machine gun opened fire in sweeping arcs, blasting holes through upper floors. Flames erupted from a building 2 doors down, spreading upward as wood caught fire. Smoke curled through Jan's attic, stinging his eyes. He blinked away tears and searched for weak points. The driver was visible for a moment through a slotted viewport. Jan fired. The bullet struck the metal just beside the opening, close enough to send the driver recoiling. The vehicle lurched, wheels scraping against rubble. A second shot cracked, and this time the driver slumped sideways. The armored car stopped abruptly, blocking the advance. SS troops ducked behind it, shouting in panic. 120, civilian escape route holds behind Jan's building. A steady stream of civilians continued fleeing south. A man carrying a toddler tripped and fell, but a boy of maybe 14 helped them up. Jan heard their footsteps echo through the floorboards. He could not see them, but he imagined their faces, ashen from smoke, eyes reflecting fear and hope in equal measure. They were the reason he stayed. Every second he delayed the SS was another second for those lives to get farther from the approaching terror. 1:33. Fire spreads. The SS set fire to the building adjacent to Jan's position, hoping smoke would force the sniper to reveal himself. Flames consumed broken chairs, fallen rafters, and hanging cloth. Heat radiated into Jan's attic, turning it into a furnace. Sweat dripped from his temples. His palms burned on the rifle stock. Smoke curled around him, making it harder to breathe. But he did not leave. He crawled to the lowest point in the attic, pressed a wet cloth to his face, and waited. 1:50. Countersniper team arrives. The SS deployed their Spezialschützen, trained countersnipers armed with scoped Kar 98K rifles. They moved cautiously, scanning the rooftops. Jan spotted one of them crawling along a balcony. The man's movement was slow, precise, expert level. This was no ordinary infantryman. Jan inhaled sharply, lowering his profile. The counter-sniper aimed at a shadow where he believed Jan was hiding. Jan did not fire immediately. He waited. When the man shifted his rifle just slightly to adjust his view, sunlight glinted off the scope. Jan fired. The bullet shattered the scope and dropped the counter-sniper instantly. A second sniper retreated out of view. The Germans' confidence cracked. They had expected amateurs, not someone who could match their specialists. 2:05. SS begins full surround. Frustrated, SS officers ordered a pincer movement. Troops advanced through courtyards and alleys to encircle Jan's building. They shouted commands layered with panic and frustration. Jan heard boots pounding stairs inside the adjacent building. The Germans were getting closer. His ammunition was down to 8 rounds. He moved toward the far side of the attic, where a small hole overlooked the rear courtyard. A squad moved beneath him, 5 soldiers, rifles raised, scanning windows. Jan fired twice. 2 fell. The others dove for cover, shouting that there were at least 3 shooters. Again, their miscalculation bought him time. 2:20. JN is wounded. The Germans finally located a firing line with clear sight. A burst from an MG-34 tore through the attic wall. Wood fragments exploded outward. A fragment cut across Jan's left shoulder, knocking him back. He gasped, gripping the wound as blood seeped through his shirt. Pain flared, but he forced himself upright, forced himself to keep breathing. He could not stop now. Below, the SS were preparing a final storming of the building. 2:35. Final position. Jan crawled toward the last intact window on the east side. Through the haze of smoke, he saw another group of civilians running, an elderly woman supported by 2 adults. SS troops were advancing behind them. Jan steadied his rifle despite shaking hands. He fired. The officer pursuing them fell. He fired again. Another soldier dropped. His rifle now held only 3 rounds. 2:50. SS flamethrowers arrived. 2 SS flamethrower operators approached the entrance. Flames spewed across the first floor, roaring upward. Heat surged through the walls. Jan coughed violently. His vision blurred. The attic groaned as support beams buckled. He knew the building would not stand much longer. But he also knew the civilians had nearly cleared the far alley. 3:05. The final shot. Jan crawled to the center beam, the strongest vantage left. SS soldiers burst into the lower floors, shouting triumphantly. Through the smoke, Jan saw one last target, an SS squad leader coordinating the assault. Jan steadied the rifle. His hands trembled. He exhaled. Fired. The bullet hit. The squad leader fell. The rifle clicked empty. At 3:08, flames engulfed the attic. SS troops stormed upward. Jan's last known act was throwing his empty rifle aside and attempting to crawl toward the eastern hatch, perhaps searching for one final vantage point, perhaps seeking air, perhaps simply refusing to die in the spot he had fought from. The rest is lost to smoke, fire, and collapse. But the civilians had escaped. A single sniper had held back an entire battalion for nearly 3 hours. When the flames finally subsided and the shooting ceased along Nowolipki Street, the SS moved cautiously through the smoldering ruins. The building that had sheltered Jan for nearly 3 hours stood half-collapsed. Its roof caved inward, its upper floors burned into a lattice of glowing beams and drifting ash. Smoke curled around shattered brick and twisted metal. The stench of fire, plaster dust, and gun oil clung to the air. SS officers advanced slowly, rifles raised, expecting to find a fortified resistance cell, a group of snipers, perhaps an entire militia detachment. Instead, they found only silence. No surviving fighters. No weapons stockpile. Only the charred remains of a single firing position and a few spent 7.62 by 54 mm casings scattered among blackened debris. According to several post-war testimonies, an SS non-commissioned officer reportedly muttered, "One man? Impossible," before ordering the building cleared and the bodies removed. But the evidence was unmistakable. The casualties littering the street did not match German expectations. Estimates vary, but surviving documents from Warsaw City archives and eyewitness accounts suggest between 12 and 19 SS soldiers were killed in the engagement, with additional wounded evacuated behind the lines. For a single sniper with no support, these numbers were extraordinary. They were also deeply humiliating for the SS, who had deployed countersnipers, machine guns, infantry squads, and armored cars to eliminate what they believed to be a coordinated defensive position. The psychological impact of realizing the truth, that their battalion had been halted by one determined teenager, left an unspoken scar on those who witnessed the engagement. The greater consequence, however, was not measured in German casualties, but in Polish lives saved. The 3-hour delay allowed hundreds of civilians to escape through the southern alleys, crossing into sectors not yet overrun by German forces. Among them were families with children, elderly neighbors carried by younger men, and groups of terrified residents clutching bundles of possessions. Many later recounted hearing the distant rifle shots behind them as they fled, not knowing who was firing, but understanding instinctively that someone was buying them time. In diaries recovered after the war, several wrote that they believed angels, or spirits, were slowing the Germans. None imagined it was just one boy. For Warsaw's defenders, the loss of the northern district was expected. The city was collapsing inch by inch under relentless pressure. What they did not expect, what they could not comprehend until survivors arrived breathless and soot-covered, was that a lone sniper had held a battalion at bay long enough to allow an entire route of escape to remain open. When word spread among resistance groups and trapped civilians that a young marksman had remained behind intentionally, refusing to flee with the last militia units, the story took on a life of its own. Some called him the ghost of Noah Lipke. Others described him as the boy with the rifle who would not fall. His identity was lost almost immediately. No surviving roster contained his full name, and the buildings where he lived were later destroyed. Yet the legend persisted. For the German command, the incident at Noah Lipke was treated as a tactical embarrassment. Reports filed after the sweep were vague and minimized the resistance encountered. Official accounts would later attribute delays to unexpected structural hazards and civilian obstruction, avoiding any mention of a lone marksman. The SS did not acknowledge that one teenager had slowed their advance long enough to alter the civilian evacuation in that sector. Historical records show that internal communications avoided referencing sniper losses in Warsaw at all, an erasure consistent with Germany's attempts to maintain the illusion of unstoppable momentum during the early days of the war. After the war, Warsaw itself became the keeper of Jan's story. With over 85% of the city destroyed and innumerable civilian death records lost, countless individual acts of courage dissolved into anonymity. But fragments survived. Scattered testimonies from civilians who fled southward described hearing one rifle firing again and again. A woman later identified as Helena Mizlarowa recalled a boy in a uniform too large for him, escorting children toward an alley the night before the SS sweep. Another survivor wrote that a young soldier returned to the attic, while others retreated. By combining these accounts, historians reconstructed the core elements of the story. A single sniper remained behind, he held his position, and his actions saved lives. Warsaw's Museum of the Rising would eventually include a small, unobtrusive display referencing an unnamed sniper who fought in the northern districts during the siege of 1939. The placard contains no photo, no confirmed birth date, and no body was ever recovered. But the inscription reads, "Some heroes are known, others are remembered." Scholars now believe this plaque refers to the very engagement described here, a symbolic recognition of all those whose names were erased by fire and rubble, but whose actions shaped the survival of others. The tactical implications of Jan's stand continue to be studied today. Military analysts examining urban warfare note that a lone sniper, properly positioned and highly motivated, can exert an influence far greater than his numbers would suggest. By forcing enemy troops to halt, deploy, and reorganize, a sniper introduces friction, a delay that can cascade into larger operational consequences. In Warsaw, that friction translated into precious minutes. Those minutes translated into life for hundreds. The human implications are even more profound. Jan's stand was not part of a grand strategy. It was not planned by senior officers or coordinated with larger resistance efforts. It was the result of a simple, devastating choice: to remain when retreat was possible, to fight when survival was unlikely, to protect others even when it meant forfeiting any chance of living through the day. His courage was not a function of rank or recognition. It was an expression of identity, shaped by the streets he grew up on and the family he refused to abandon. In the years after World War II, survivors who fled that morning rebuilt their lives in Warsaw, Krakow, New York, Tel Aviv, and Buenos Aires. Many kept journals. Some raised children who would later ask how they had escaped the SS sweep. Again and again, variations of the same answer appeared. Someone stayed behind. Though they never knew his name, they knew what he had done. Their survival was his legacy. Warsaw itself is a monument to such acts. Its rebuilt streets, its reconstructed facades, and its memorial plaques all speak to a brutal truth. The city stands because thousands of individuals, many forgotten, chose to resist. Jan was one of them. One of the uncounted, one of the unnamed, one of the irreplaceable few whose bravery shaped the fate of many. In the final measure, the siege of Warsaw was shaped not only by armies, commanders, or the sweeping strategies of invading powers, but by moments, brief, fragile moments in which ordinary people chose to stand their ground against forces far greater than themselves. At 7:12 a.m. on September 25, 1939, a single rifle cracked through the smoke above Nowolipki Street, and for the next 3 hours a 19-year-old conscript held back an entire SS battalion. His endurance did not stop the fall of Warsaw, nor did it alter the course of the campaign. But it changed everything for the hundreds of civilians who escaped southward while he fought alone in the burning rafters of a collapsing building. His sacrifice, quiet and unrecorded, is a reminder that the weight of history is often carried by those whose names never appear in books. Jan Nowak's story forces us to ask questions that linger long after the echoes of battle fade. What makes an ordinary boy choose to become the shield of a retreating crowd? How does one person find the resolve to face overwhelming force with only a rifle and the narrow beams of a burning attic as cover? And if courage like his existed in the darkest days of 1939, what does it ask of us now, in a world shaped by the sacrifices of those who never lived to see peace? As you reflect on the streets of Warsaw, rebuilt from ashes, and imagine the last moments of the young sniper who fought alone for strangers, remember that heroism is often unseen, uncelebrated, and unrewarded, yet it is no less real. If one rifle could delay an army long enough to save hundreds, what impact can a single act of bravery make today? Share this story, honor those who stood when standing meant death, and help ensure that the forgotten courage of men like Jan Nowak is never lost to time.